All right, I've managed to unmute myself. Sorry about that, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me now. So I'm going to be talking about agricultural risk, and as I just said, I work in the insurance industry, so this is geared towards modelling risk for the insurance industry. But I work with the agriculture, so a lot of it is about modelling crops and then working out expected yields and then using that to model losses. So it's quite relevant for any crop modelling as well. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to Aon and our agriculture team here in the Asia Pacific region. Then I will have a talk about the different agriculture models that are available. And then I will specifically go into Aon's agriculture models in more detail. I will probably talk for about 25 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be time for questions and answers. So this is our team. At the moment, we've got about 5 people modelling agriculture in the Asia Pacific region. We do have, as a company, we have analysts in all regions of the world, but down here in the Pacific, there's myself. I've been working with Aon for about 10 years. We also have Amar Deep, who is from Bangalore, and he is actually currently building our crop model for India. I have a background in statistics. Amar is mechanical engineering, but he's a very good programmer, which is a skill you need, I think, particularly for modelling nowadays. There's so much data to handle, you do have to be a programmer to be able to do it properly. And then we have a good group in China. China has a very big agricultural insurance program, which is supported by the government. And so we have a lot of business in China, and we have 3 women working up there specifically for agriculture. Ching, who has a PhD in forestry, Rume, who's got a master's in economics, and Mandy, who has a master's in meteorology. So we've got a really good group and a wide range of skills. So just some general ideas about what is a model and why we would even bother modelling anything. Basically, I see models as a way of mathematically representing the world. So if we can find it, I mean, it's never going to be completely correct, but if we can get a good mathematical representation of the real world system, then we can start asking it questions. We can give us a better idea of what we can expect in the present and also in the future. So all hazard models or modelling of losses or modelling sort of events that would cause damage or losses to the world start with identifying the event that can occur, then working out how that event will affect your exposure. So in our case, it's going to be crops, but it could be buildings, it could be anything. And then from there, for insurance, we go the extra point where we work out what the claims are. And that it basically needs an understanding of the policies that are in place. So here is a little bit of a more graphical representation. So you've got your hazard, and that can be defined in lots of ways. So it can be the intensity of the hazard. So we'll say with a cyclone, is it a Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5? How long the event takes place, and in some cases, particularly for things like drought and flooding, you know, the duration is almost as important as the intensity, or can be more so. And then the spatial extent of the event. So how great an area does it affect? And all of these things are very interrelated. Sorry about that. All of these are very interrelated, so generally the higher the intensity, the greater the spatial extent. Again, with the duration as well, the longer the duration, the greater the spatial extent. So it's not, you need to find correlations between those as well. So once you've identified what your hazard is, and in terms of agriculture, generally the hazards tend to be droughts, major floods, cyclones, and large fire events as well. So once you have that, then you have to try and develop a vulnerability curve. And the vulnerability curve is basically a curve which tries to fit your hazard data onto your loss data. So, you basically say if your wind speed is, say, 300 kilometres an hour, then you expect to lose, the roof of a house or something like that. The depth of the flood, if a flood lasts for 5 days, then maybe crop yields will reduce by 40%. All of those things. So you're trying to find a curve which will allow you to match up your hazards and all the characteristics of the hazards with all the losses that happens. And as well as the vulnerability, you also know what your exposure is or what your elements at risk are. So, if it's over bare land or snow or something like that, you're not going to have much losses. If it's under a paddy field, maybe the losses will be higher. And in terms of agriculture, also the exposure is very much affected by the time of year and the growth stage of the crop as well. So you have to bring that into account. But pretty much all models and agricultural models will be a subset of that, will involve all of these issues. So why build a model? They're quite expensive to do. They take a long time. It took us quite a few years to build our crop model for China and India. So what's the point of doing them? I think one of the most important things is that, we live within our memories. So we sort of have memories of what events have occurred in the past, and we expect the world to be very similar to what the past was like. But, if you're only 20 years old, you might not have lived through a 1 in 100 year drought. If you've only been farming for 10 years, you don't know what like a 40-year drought will be. So one way of working out what could happen in the future or even in the present next year would be to build a model which when you build a model, you can sort of simulate tens of thousands of events. So there's a chance that you'll get more likely to get a large event into your modelling amount of data. You can find, frequencies and probabilities of events going back from a long time ago and include that in your model. And I think it gives you a better way to explain the world. This is just an example of if you just go on your historical losses, especially in insurance, in a lot of countries, especially this place of the world, agriculture insurance has only been going for the last 9 or 10 years. India is a special case. India has had a huge agriculture insurance program going back for a long time, but that's unusual in this part of the world. And also, even though India has been going for a long time, it's actually been quite a small program. And compared to the program that you now have, which is the PMFBI program, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, that's much wider, much higher coverage. So it's a lot different. So generally, there's very little historical data. And this just shows here, I'm just sort of pointing out that this was a syndicate which writes agricultural, and from 2001 to 2001 to 2008 or 9, very low loss ratios. 50-60% was the highest. Obviously, everyone's making money, and then 2010 there's a big loss event and 300% loss ratio. There is no way you could have predicted that based on your historical knowledge. If you knew that you were modelling a catastrophe event and you said, well, I'm going to model this, but I'm going to use a Pareto curve or a very extreme curve that has some really long tail losses, then there is a chance that you might have actually predicted this event. This is a similar one for windstorm losses in Sweden. So this is from an insurance company and the losses they incurred. And as you can see, I mean, this goes back to 1900. So over 100 years of data, and yet you still get this huge loss here that was never predicted and, you know, very unusual. So to me, that's the main reason why we model things. Generally for claims, this will probably, you can refer to losses in the same sense. Generally they tend to follow an extreme value curve. Depending on the hazard, the tail is longer, and you have more extreme events, like cyclones, large fires might have a more extreme curve than a flood. But generally claims are truncated so that we know it's already not going to be a normal curve. You can't have zero negative claims, so it's already not a normal curve, and it's very likely that you get long tail events. And I tell my clients all the time that even though your data looks really good and you haven't had a high claim, one day it will happen, and you might as well know what it's going to do. So, main reasons for modelling, you can work out for your country what's the main drivers of losses. You know, I mean, you can do that with historical data, but you can also do that by analysing and looking at a model. You can say how sensitive are losses to particular weather events. So change the frequency of a weather event and see how sensitive your loss events are. Modelling can also highlight correlations between risks and locations, and in my mind, correlation plays a huge part, especially in the extreme loss events. And also, models can help us predict the effects of changes in frequency and the severity of natural hazards. I think, you know, the majority of the world now believes that our climate will be changing in the future, and it's very likely that extreme weather events will become more frequent. There's a little quote there. You know, basically, if you've got a 1 in 100 year event and suddenly now it becomes a 1 in 12 year event, that's going to totally change the way you're going to deal with that event. Your bridges won't stand up, you know, the infrastructure now has to completely change. So models can help us do that. You know, we can change, if we know that the frequency in the past has been this much, then we can increase the frequency and see what that looks like. We can increase the severity of certain events and see what that looks like. Okay, so I think probably I'll just go through this and try and answer questions at the end, because I was so late dialing in and had my mute on. I'm running a little bit late, so I'll just wait to the end for questions. So basically there's 3 models that are the most used. There's probably other models, and also you can use a bit of a, you know, you can use all 3 models as well. So you don't have to be stuck to one model. A yield-based model, which is what we've used for our crop models, a crop growth model, and a weather to yield regression model. And they have, you know. So basically, but one thing to remember is that all models are totally dependent on the data that you have. And particularly I find for agriculture modelling, you tend to have, you've got data at particular levels. This is just a picture of China showing the different administration levels. There's 34 provinces in China. If you've only got data on a provincial level, it's, you know, it's not very useful. It might be able to help you tell you something, but given that you've got over almost 3,000 counties, and that doesn't really, and each county probably has several thousand farms within it, provincial data isn't that great. So you can see, basically, the more granular your data is, the better your model is going to be. One good thing now about satellite images with the European Space Agency, they now have some really good granular data. I think the latest one is down to 300 metres, and all of that is freely available. So granular, we're getting much better data at a much better level. But unfortunately, you still need historical data to build your models. So. Okay, yield-based model, which is what we've been using. So this uses historical yields, and we use that to get an expected distribution of yields or future yields. And then we model losses based on simulated yields. So we basically say, in the past, this is what yields look like. Now I can simulate 10,000 yields, and then I can say each one of those simulations is a farmer. Each year, what would they have been paid out? Would their yields have been up or down? That sort of thing. So it's purely based on the actual yield of the crop. The pros are that this data is typically available. A lot of governments, due to food security and things like that, they keep a very good records of the yield data. It's not always at the right level that we want, but quite often, particularly as we did, you go into local libraries and local agricultural companies, that yield data is available. Other good thing is that especially if you have multi-peril crop insurance, which a lot of countries do, the yield reflects all the perils that affected it during the year. You can't necessarily tease out whether a loss was hail or drought or flood. There are ways of doing that, but it is a multi-peril yield. And there's no aggregation of the modelling area. So that basically means that as you sort of go from a county level up to a province level, up to a country level, you're not getting more and more error because you've sort of built it on the actual yields in the ground. Cons is one, and this is a particularly hard one to deal with, is farming practices change quite a lot over time. New types of seed get used, fertilizers get used, people just get better at growing crops. So if we're wanting to predict future yields, we're going to have to do something about that. We normally detrend. There's a quite issue with granularity of the data. So, obviously quite often policies or insurance policies are written at a farm level, but we might not have data at that level. For China, we have it at a county level. For India, we have it at a TESOL level. And this is, they tendency to reflect the conditions which have occurred during the data period. For our crop model, we had data from 1980 onwards. So, if there was a really big event that didn't occur during that time, that's not going to be in our data. Now, the crop growth model, basically, and this is used in a lot of countries, but it basically says for every crop that we have, we know how much soil, we know how much temperature it needs, how much sunlight it needs, how much rainfall it needs, and if it gets all of these optimal conditions, then we can say, well, we expect this yield from it. So it's basically using information from the climate or the weather conditions during the growing phase of the crop to predict what the yield was. This is quite good because weather stations are often available. There's a lot of now automatic weather stations where data can just be downloaded on a daily basis. It's a wide variety of perils, and you might not have to detrend like you do with yields because if you know that you use a new variety of crops and you know what the yields are available for those, then you can just plug the new varieties into your model. The cons, again, is all about whether the data is available at the unit that you want. If you only have, say, 4 weather stations, in each county or in each state in India, then there's a lot of weather variation that is not going to be known. Weather is very local, so the more weather stations you have, the better. And the other thing is that you need to know very accurately when the crops are grown, when they're going to be, when they're planted, what the growth stage is and things like that, because the requirements for crops differ depending on the growth stage. So you need to know when the crop goes in the ground as well. The third one is a weather to yield regression model. So this basically says you take all your weather information, you take your yield information, and you try and fit a curve to go through that for based on the rainfall, temperature, amount of sunlight, that sort of stuff, and you can just do a regression of weather onto yield. This has similar to the crop growth model, just basically whether the weather information is available at the right geographic location, and whether you know exactly when the growth stage of each crop. But in addition, whenever you regress something, you tend to sort of smooth out the outliers and in our case, outliers tell us a lot of information. Outliers tend to be extreme events, like a very extreme drought, and you want to make sure you keep that in your model. You don't want to lose that. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of the models that we have, and I'm going to try and finish in about 15 minutes so that we've got lots of time for questions. So on the left, if you can see it, we've got this is Andhra Pradesh, I think. And here what we're looking at is basically the variations, the coefficient of variation of yields. And you can sort of see up here in sort of the more border regions, you get a bit more variation than you do here. And we find that this coefficient of variation is very much very similar to the climate or the climatology of the state as well. So I think it gets a bit drier up in this area here, or maybe it's wetter, but I think it gets drier, and you'll find sort of more marginal farming around here, whereas around here the farming's are, the weather variations, or maybe it's just better conditions for farming. So, this gives us some good information already. If you were going to be writing insurance, you want to be sort of thinking, where do I want to write my insurance? If I write my insurance all around here, I can charge a premium rate that might be a little bit lower than if I'm writing up in the top there. So, in general, insurance for crop insurance, they pretty much break even. They don't make a huge amount of money. And knowing things about this, they give you an idea of where your marginal things are and where you might have to adjust your premium rates. On the right here, we've got Heilongjiang province, which is up the top of China. And again, this area here is part of it's a very big drought plain that comes in. There's Jilin that comes in here, and another province down here, but it's all big part of a big drought plain. And so we've sort of labelled these in terms of risky and least risky, but it's the same thing. Risky generally means, how much variation have you got? And the more variation you have in your yields, then the more risky it is. So when we were building our crop model, we had already built a model in America, and we use the same methodology or the same framework. So it's quite good now. We've got a really good framework for the US, we've got China, we've got India, and Amar, as he's running the Indian one, he's making sure that we can scale it up to any country. We're going to sort of have like a generic model. So as long as we've got the data that we can plug into it, we can build a model for it. So this is just a flow chart showing you what happens. Basically, we take our yield data, we detrend it, we work out the correlation dynamics. And again, you have to be very careful of correlation, and it's actually a very hard thing to do. Once we've done that, we fit a distribution, so we work out what sort of distribution we have for the yields. We generally look at normal to a skewed normal yield distribution. Remember, as I said, losses or claims were log normal, but that's because claims can't go below zero, really. So you're also always got a truncated distribution. But yields tend to be either normal or a little bit skewed to the left. So a normal distribution is not a bad one to take, and I think we fit either a log normal or a skewed normal to most of our yield distributions. Then the next step, which is actually very difficult, is we go from the yield distribution at whatever geographic level we have, which for China it's county, and as I said for India it's Tesla level, but mostly the farmers or the insurance is written at a household level or a farm level. So we have to find a way to go from a county level or Tesla level to an actual farm level. In some cases in India and China, within a village, I think the whole village gets insured and they all sort of get the same claim as well. So sometimes it's knocked down to a household level, but it's generally at a lower level than we have our data for. And then once we've done all of that, then we simulate thousands, hundreds and millions of thousands of yields, and each simulation is sort of a household or a policy holder. And once we do that, we can aggregate losses up to any area. So if we want to talk to our insurance clients, we can tell them what their expected losses for a province, for a state, for a city, or down at the individual level. And then, of course, we have to validate the model, and that also involves taking data as well. Generally, quite often you can do things, I mean, we have insurance clients that will give us our claims data, which is very good for validation on. Other ways you can validate, if you don't have that, is in the beginning you can sort of separate out some of your initial data, and not use that, and then you can sort of come back and use it in the end to give you an idea of your validation and validating against non-model data as well. But there's lots of ways of validating models. Okay, so basically we've got to detrend the data, and first of all you've got to clean it and fill it in, and this takes a long time. You've got issues that, people spell things differently. Sometimes it's, there's missing data quite often. All sorts of stuff happen, and if you've got missing data, you've got to try and fill it in. One way of filling it in is, this is one way we used, and what we do is if we've got data if there's some missing data for one county, then we find other counties that are close by, and we find ones that are the best match based on ones, if the yield was down in our county that we have data for, was the yield down in the other county. And we find like the best matching county based on how close it is, how close their history or how close they have been in the past. We've got data for both counties, and also we can look at the climate as well. So basically what you do is, if you've got a missing year, then you can take the year from the matching county, work out what the ratio of the good matching county is to the target county in most years. So you work out your ratio, and then for the missing year, you use your good county and apply the same ratio to get your missing data. There are other techniques, but that one's not a bad one. Making sure that you've got one in close proximity is very important. Now, detrending, as I said before, you've got changes in agricultural practices and farming practices. Generally, most countries in the world, yields have increased over time. So we need to, some way, we don't want to just chuck out all that data that we had from the past. So we need to find some way to bring that data up to, to the same level as it would be if it was the same farmer growing in the year 2018. There's always lots of random variation around the yield. The random variation we want to keep, because random variation is basically the weather. If your yields are down, it's usually because the weather has affected them, or you've had a pest or disease, or some sort of thing has affected the yields. So we don't want to get rid of that. We've got to keep it, because that tells us something, but we do want to detrend it. So basically, if you think of lots of variation, systemic variation is the change in practices, and random variation is due to the weather, and we want to keep the random but get rid of the systematic. This is some data from China, and this, you see this a lot. You see in the past you've got a curve, you've got a straight line showing that yes, the yield's increasing, but actually after a while this levels off, and you can't get much better. And the practices, you've got really good seed, really good practices, so your yields aren't going to keep detrending. So you can't detrend this bit, you want to detrend this bit. So there's lots of ways. Looking at data is probably the best way to do it, but generally you can't do that because you've got too much data. You can imagine how many, well, there was 2,000 counties in China that we had. I think for India it's even bigger, so you can't really look at every single line and make a call. So generally we've used SAS, and SAS basically we can ask it to identify, we call this a kink, or we can ask it to give us a line, a best fit line. These are some ideas of different lines that you can use. So you can see the first one's just a straight linear one. You've got a exponential curve and a logarithmic curve. This one I think is, this is showing here you've got increasing yields and then it levels off. This one is just a straight, and you don't have to use the same curve for the whole data. You can, if you've got data that levels off, you can fit like this curve here and then not detrend further on. For India, we've got a new method, which we use now called the Loess method, which is sort of like a moving average, a smooth moving average. And it's sort of basically chops the trend up, or chops your data period up, and sort of fits a curve to each section. And you can see here there's nothing here, then it goes up. Yeah, this one's it's hard to know what's going on here really, but we're assuming that in here, and we did have some information about it, but we assume in here that a whole lot of new seeds and different seeds, and the whole village decided to change the new seeds, so you've got an increase and then you've got a level off. So SAS is very good for detrending. It has lots of methods that you can do. One thing you have to be very careful of with detrending is for India in particular, and Australia as well, if you have a weather event that occurs a cyclical weather event, such as the ENSO or La Nina and El Nino. They occur every 7 years on average. So you could, and you can, they can last for 2 or 3 years, sometimes the effect of them. So you want to make sure that when you're detrending, you're not just saying, oh, actually it was just, a 5-year drought and then all the yields went up. Because you want to know if there was a 5-year drought, you want to know that, and you want that in your history, because that is going to occur again. So with the Loess method and other methods, you can specify a minimum moving window, and that tells you that, generally I've got 5 years. If you want to be more conservative, you can have 7 years, and it says, if there's a big vary, it means that you just sort of increase, you prolong the section, or increase the length of the section that you're detrending, and that hopefully doesn't mean that as soon as the drought finishes and the yields go up that you detrend. you should really keep those yields low because they're low due to the weather event, and we want to keep the weather information. Now, it's very important, the way we want to keep the annual variation in there due to weathers. So what we generally do, and I'll show you a graph showing this, or a table, is that we detrend the data, we work out, when we put the trend line in, we work out what is the percent deviation from the trend for every data point. So for every yield, for every annual yield we have, we overlay our trend, whether that is a polynomial trend, moving average trend, whatever we're using, we overlay on that. And then we say, well, what was the yield and how much is the deviation from our trend? Basically, we work out what the residual is. And then we work out, and the way we detrend now is we say, well, this is what we expect the long-term average yield to be, but we want to keep the same deviation from the average trend that we already saw in the non-detrended data. So we just take the long-term average and then we plus or minus by the percent deviation. You can do it by the actual deviation or the percent deviation. It depends on your data and how much variation you have in there at all, and also it depends on how much the yields change, because generally variation increases as yields increase as well. So you have to keep that into account. This just gives you a little bit of an idea. We've got the expected long-term average here, which is we've worked out, which is the end of our trend line. This is what the actual yield was. You've got what the trend line was. So, you know, it was 0.25, and you think, oh, that's really low, but actually it was only 1% from what we would have predicted from our trend line. So then we add that 1% from or you take it, yeah, you add the 1%. So actually for the first year, the yield was a little bit higher than average. And you can see some years are lower, so it's just this idea that we really want to know what is the amount of variation from what you'd expect, and the variation is basically the weather conditions or what happened. Okay, once we've detrended, then we've got to fit everything to a distribution. So generally, this was all done in SAS for our models as well. So we work out what we think is the distribution for every county, and then, or Tessel if it was in there, and we work out a distribution. Generally, it's a log normal or a skewed normal, as I said. And then we can say, we now can simulate county yields. And then, unfortunately, we've got a county, but we have to go down to policy level. And I'm going to be very quick with this because we're running out of time. Basically, what we say is that we expect the policy or farm level yields to all have the same average. When you add them all up, they have the same sort of average yield to the county, but we expect the variation to be a lot higher. So we're basically saying the smaller the unit, the more variable it is, but overall it will have a similar distribution to the county that it's in, but we expect to have a lot more variation. And that's what we do. We use the same distribution, but we increase the standard deviation of the distribution. And there's lots of ways of working out how to do that, but it depends on the amount of volatility you have historically. We use a lot of information from the US because they have excellent data. They had data at the farm level going from like early 1900s right up to present, so they have a very good take on the variability at the farm level versus the county level, or I think it's county level. So basically, in some ways, what we did is we worked out, we mapped, if we had similar agronomic zones, then we started with the US increase in variation, or their their estimation, and then we use that as a starting point for our China model. Farm size is a big factor. If the farm sizes are much smaller than they are in the US, then we might want to increase the variation a bit more. And then basically once we've got that, then we can say, right, well, we can simulate now farm level yields. And that is the basis of our crop model. We then turn these into losses, which is basically based on the policy terms and conditions of the insurance company. Usually there's like an excess or something like that. So we have to sort of say, well, your yield was down, how much would based on the policy that the farmer gets paid out, how much would the insurance company have paid out? And this gives you a bit of an idea. This is just saying that basically this is your yield. If this has got a 70% excess on it or a 30% excess, so anything in here wouldn't be paid out. But as the yield gets lower and lower and lower, then your payment, you get more and more payment. Yes, and then obviously you have to validate it. So as I said, we were lucky to have claims data from our companies. So we would use our estimated yields, and we would sort of, in a good year and a bad year, in our data from our companies, we had a really bad drought year, so that was good. We could say, well, if it was a bad drought year, what will we expect losses to be? And then you sort of calibrate the model based on that. I did want to do just talk a little bit about correlation. This is something I've learned quite recently. I've spent a lot of time thinking about correlation. And I think particularly weather hazards or climate hazards, there's a lot of correlation involved. So when we build our models, we correlate if you've got different crop types or livestock types that are all within the same county, then we expect those to be correlated. We also expect sort of regions within the same climatic zone to be correlated. So we try and build that correlation to our model. So when we simulate our yields, we're also simulating correlated yields. So we're really simulating like we're not just simulating one yield, we're simulating a distribution of correlated yields. And if you think of something, and what we've moved from, we were originally doing linear correlations, which if you look at a linear correlation, it basically says that the correlation between, say, two counties is exactly the same regardless of the yield loss or the weather conditions. But we think that's probably not realistic. Like if it's if it's a normal year, you know, everybody sort of gets a good yield, some are a little bit down, some are a bit, but there's a bit of variation in it. If it's a really bad year, like if it's a bad drought, the monsoon fails, basically everybody gets a bad yield. So in our understanding or we think that the correlation increases with the extremity of the event. So the higher your yield losses, we actually think there's probably a lot more correlation going on, because it's probably a big extreme drought, extreme flood, or a huge cyclone that's come through and everybody gets affected. So we now use gumball correlation, which is basically the correlation increases between the distributions that we're correlating, increases as our events, the extremity of our events or the extremity of our yield losses increase as well. Okay, so that was quite quick. So I'll have a look at these questions and answers. And if you've got any other questions, I will try and answer them as well. I'm not sure about the PowerPoint. I'll just check if that's all right, and I'll coordinate with Secure Pro about that. And if that's fine with our marketing team, then I'm happy to share. No, we don't really use linear regression. As I said, we tend to, we do use multivariate regression methods, but linear is not I don't feel that a linear regression is that useful in the real world for the types of data that we're using. So we do use multivariate regression techniques, but it tends not to be a linear regression. In the insurance industry, the crop models are proprietary. We generally share our results with our clients, and that's part of the service we provide. But we sort of keep the model ourselves and run the model, sort of have the black box model, and we run it, and we're happy to share the results. So the last one is about, would we share the detailed methodology? I can probably share some papers that we used, and the papers are sort of outline quite a lot of the modelling methodology. A lot of the papers are open knowledge, and as a researcher, I always go and look and see how people modelled things in the past, and I generally use the most modern accepted technique. So I can share some papers on that. And yes, we are building a crop model for India as you speak. At the moment, I think we've got about 2 states done, and we're working on finishing that, and we have a lot of clients in India that we work very closely with. And I don't know how many of you know, but your Modi had a very he's very pro large insurance program for farmers, and just basically the insurance makes sure that you can still grow your crop next year even though you didn't get a crop based on monsoon. I wasn't sure what you mean by typical issues. Typical issues, I tried to sort of, the issues that we generally have is getting the data. It's quite hard to find. Like for China, we had to go to all the universities. We just sent people to universities in the local cities, and basically had to photocopy the data and type it in ourselves. For India, we have a bit of both. We have one of our clients is the Agricultural Insurance Company of India, and they helped us a lot with validating some of our modelling. And again, like in India, they do crop cutting experiments. So every year, every village, a local official will go in, they make a sample, they sort of take a square of crop, and within like a designated sample zone, they basically harvest that crop, and they work out what the yield was, and then they apply that yield across to all crops in the village, or all of the same crop within the village, and that data is publicly available. So we've used that data. Water resources, that's a bit of a hard one. We do have some data on weather stations. India has a lot of automatic weather stations, and a lot of the historical data is free. There's also now a lot of resources available from the Dartmouth Drought Observatory, which I think now is part of NASA, and they have a lot of, and also both the European Space Agency, also the Japanese Satellite Agency, and also India, you can get a lot of weather data now, and you can use satellite weather data now a lot. Some of that now is going back to 1980, so you've got quite a good, you've got quite a good history there. So I would, there's a lot of data freely available, and there is a lot of data available, but you just have to go in and find it and type it in yourself. And it's a pretty boring job, data entry, but building models is actually a very interesting job. Right, yeah, I've got a bit more time for a few more questions. So hopefully that was interesting, and you learned something, and I didn't go too fast. Oh, someone's just asked which crops. We've just sort of done the main crops for India, so we do rice, wheat, gram, sorghum, and cotton, and there's a few more crops, but I'm not even going to try and pronounce them because you will all laugh at me. If anyone wants to contact me, my name, you can contact me through my work. My name's Jill.Bolland at aonbenfield.com, and I'm sure that organisers, I'm happy for them to share those details with you. All right, I think if there's no more questions, we can probably leave it there. Thanks very much. You might even be able to see me. Fine.